The day I buried my husband was also the day my sister slapped me across the face in front of the church full of mourners and told everyone her son was his. The sting on my cheek was nothing compared to the fire in my chest. Her words echoed in the cold air, like the toll of a bell announcing a death I had not yet processed. Then, as if that humiliation was not enough, she reached into her black leather bag, pulled out a folded document, and declared it was my late husband's will. I remember the smell of lilies mixed with rain, the heavy gray clouds pressing down on the cemetery, and the way every head turned toward me. My knees threatened to give out, but I stood there frozen, clutching the edge of my black coat. I'd spent the past week trying to survive the loss of David, the man I thought had been my one safe harbor, in a life surrounded by storms. Now that safe harbor was gone, and the storm had a name: Sophie, my younger sister. My parents stood beside her, their faces unreadable, their silence as loud as the gasp from the guests. Somewhere a baby whimpered, and I wondered if that was the child she claimed was David's. My mind could not catch up. I had buried my husband less than an hour ago, and yet I was being buried under something far heavier than dirt. It was not just grief anymore. It was betrayal, and it was public. My name is Margaret, and I am 38 years old. For most of my life, I have been the quiet one in my family, the one who learned early that speaking too loudly or wanting too much only invited criticism. My parents raised two daughters, but their hearts seemed to belong entirely to my younger sister, Sophie. She was born with the kind of beauty that made people lean closer and a charm that wrapped itself around anyone she wanted. I was the steady shadow in the background, the one who studied hard, worked a steady job, and never caused trouble. At least not the kind of trouble they noticed. The truth is, my family had always been a cage. The bars were made of rules about how to speak, how to dress, how to keep our lives looking perfect to outsiders. Sophie was allowed to bend those rules because she was their favorite. I was expected to uphold them, so the family image remained spotless. When I met David in my late 20s, he seemed like an escape. He was calm, where my family was chaotic kind, where they were sharp and controlling. He worked as an architect, loved old jazz records, and never raised his voice at me. When we married, I thought I had finally found a safe harbor. But David never fully stood between me and my family. He kept a polite distance from them and often encouraged me to try to mend things, even when I knew there was nothing to mend. Sophie visited us occasionally, flashing her smile and her endless stories, but I always sensed something beneath the surface, a current of envy or competition. I ignored it, thinking it was just my imagination. I had no children, though not for lack of trying. After years of silent disappointment, I accepted that maybe our life together would simply be the two of us, and that was enough for me. My parents saw it as a flaw, as if my inability to give them grandchildren was a stain on my worth. Sophie, of course, had a child within a year of marrying her wealthy boyfriend, a man who left her soon after. My parents embraced her and her baby as if they were royalty. I told myself I was used to being on the outside of my own family. What I did not know was that they were preparing to push me out entirely. The church was heavy with the smell of lilies and candle wax when the service ended, and people began filing out toward the cemetery. I stood near the casket, numb to everything but the sound of the rain against the stained glass windows. Friends and neighbors approached with polite handshakes and murmured condolences that barely reached my ears. I saw Sophie moving through the crowd, her black dress tailored perfectly, her hair gleaming under the dim lights. She looked more like someone attending a gala than a funeral. She stopped in front of me, and for a brief second, I thought she was going to hug me. Instead, her hand swung fast and hard across my face, the crack of it slicing through the murmurs in the room. Gasps filled the space. My cheek burned, but my mind struggled to register what had just happened. Sophie's voice rose sharp and clear. "Tell them the truth, Margaret. Tell them my son is David's." Her words were so surreal, I almost laughed, but the looks on the faces around me told me no one thought it was a joke. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded document, her hand steady and deliberate. "This is David's will," she announced, her eyes sweeping the room. "It states that if he has a child outside of marriage, that child is entitled to a share of his estate, including the house Margaret lives in." She turned toward the front pew where my parents sat. They both stood and walked to her side without hesitation. My father's arm rested protectively on her shoulder, while my mother gave me a look that was half pity, half triumph. Around us, the whispers grew louder. Some people stared at me as if I were already guilty. Others avoided my eyes altogether. I felt the ground shift beneath me. Just an hour ago, I had been saying goodbye to the man I loved. Now I was being accused in front of our community of living a lie, of being the other woman in my own marriage. I searched for words, but they would not come. Sophie handed the will to a man in a dark suit who I later learned was her lawyer. The sight of legal papers at my husband's funeral made my stomach twist. I turned to my parents, desperate for some sign that they would defend me, but they stayed close to Sophie, their loyalty clear. My breath caught in my throat. I was alone, and the attack had only just begun. The hours after the funeral blurred into a gray haze of rain-soaked clothes, and the taste of cold coffee left untouched on my kitchen counter. That night, I sat in the dark staring at the empty chair where David used to read the newspaper every morning. I replayed every moment of the day in my head, the slap, the accusation, the will waved in the air like a weapon. My phone buzzed with messages from relatives. Most of them cautious inquiries laced with barely hidden curiosity. A few simply asked if Sophie's claim was true. None offered comfort. 2 days later, an envelope arrived by courier. Inside was a formal letter from Sophie's attorney demanding that I prepare to divide David's estate in accordance with the will. There was also a note handwritten by Sophie herself. It read, "You can avoid the embarrassment of a trial if you sign now. Think about the child." The arrogance in her words made my hands shake. I drove to my parents' house, hoping to at least hear them deny her claims in private. My mother opened the door, her eyes darting past me as if she did not want the neighbors to see us talking. "We believe Sophie is just doing what is right for her son," she said finally, her voice cool and certain. My father stood in the hallway, his arms crossed. He added, "It is better to settle quietly, Margaret. David would not want this to get ugly." I could barely breathe. I asked them if they truly believed David had betrayed me. Neither answered. My father turned away. My mother adjusted the sleeve of her sweater and said, "You never gave him children. Maybe he wanted a family." Her words landed like stones in my chest. I left without saying goodbye. Over the next week, I noticed neighbors avoiding my gaze at the grocery store. Friends who had once invited me for dinner stopped calling. The story Sophie had planted was growing roots in every corner of my life. Late at night, I lay awake in the dark listening to the silence of the house. The scent of David's cologne still clung to the jacket hanging by the door, and it made my heart ache with a mixture of grief and rage. I began to realize this was not just about losing David. This was about losing the last fragile threads of belonging I had left. My family was gone in every way that mattered, and the world seemed content to believe I was the villain in my own story. It was on the 8th day after the funeral when I heard the knock on my door. I opened it to find Linda, my mother-in-law, standing there with a large umbrella and a paper bag in her hand. Her face was pale, but her eyes held a steady calm. I made tea, and we sat at the kitchen table, the rain tapping softly against the window. She studied me for a long moment before speaking. "David once gave me something," she said quietly, "and told me only to open it if I believed you were in real danger. I thought he was being overprotective. Now I see he was preparing for this." From the bag, she pulled a worn envelope with my name written in David's handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were several folded documents and a small leather notebook. The documents were medical records from years ago, showing that David was infertile due to an accident he had suffered in college. The probability of natural conception was listed as nearly 0. My breath caught in my throat. The notebook contained David's own words written in his careful script. He described how Sophie had started visiting him at his office, bringing coffee and lunch under the guise of keeping him company. He wrote that she had confessed feelings for him, and that he had told her firmly nothing could ever happen. She did not stop. He mentioned that she had taken photos during a charity event, and that later she sent him messages he never replied to. He worried she might twist things if she ever wanted to hurt us. Linda reached across the table and took my hand. "This is not just about property, Margaret. This is about protecting David's name." I nodded, unable to speak. A wave of anger stronger than anything I had felt in the past week surged through me. Sophie had not only tried to destroy me, she had tried to stain the memory of the man who had been my safe harbor. I told Linda I was not going to sign anything. She smiled faintly and said, "Then we fight." She gave me the name of a lawyer. She trusted a man named Michael Harris, who specialized in inheritance disputes. That night, for the first time since David died, I slept with a sense of purpose. The grief was still there, but beneath it was something new, cold, and steady. It was resolve. Sophie had thrown the first blow in public. I would make sure she faced the truth in the same way. Michael Harris's office smelled faintly of old books and fresh coffee. He was a tall man in his 50s, with a calm, steady gaze that made me feel both seen and challenged. I told him everything from the slap at the funeral to the letter from Sophie's lawyer to the medical records and the notebook Linda had given me. He listened without interrupting, jotting occasional notes in a leather pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "Sophie's claim is aggressive, and she has the advantage of your parents and public opinion on her side," he said evenly. "The will's language about an illegitimate child is vague enough that a sympathetic judge could rule in her favor unless we dismantle her entire narrative." He spread the medical records out on the desk alongside the notebook. "These are powerful," he continued, "but we will need to verify them with the issuing hospital and prepare for Sophie to claim forgery. The DNA test between Linda and the child will be the most decisive step. If it proves no biological connection to David, her case collapses." The thought of dragging the child into the process made my stomach twist, but Michael's tone left no room for hesitation. "We either fight with every tool or we lose." Over the next 2 weeks, I met with Michael almost daily. We reviewed every piece of paper, every text message, every social media post from Sophie that hinted at her motives. Michael coached me on how to testify without letting my emotions control me. He reminded me that Sophie would try to provoke me on the stand. Linda sat in on some sessions, offering quiet support and answering questions about David's past. Slowly, I began to shed the image of the grieving widow and step into the role of a woman defending her dignity. I learned how to keep my answers short, precise, and unwavering. I stopped caring about whispers in the grocery store. I focused only on the courtroom that was now my battlefield. The night before the first hearing, I stood in David's study and touched the spine of every book on his shelf as if to draw strength from them. I whispered a promise into the empty room. "They will not destroy us. Not you, not me." When I closed the door behind me, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Tomorrow, Sophie would see that I was no longer the easy target she thought I was. The morning of the hearing, the air outside the courthouse was cold enough to make my breath visible. Reporters had gathered near the steps, their cameras flashing, as Sophie arrived flanked by my parents and her lawyer. She wore a modest black dress and minimal makeup, her hair pulled back to give her the appearance of a humble, grieving figure. I walked in with Michael on one side and Linda on the other, feeling the eyes of strangers follow us. Inside the courtroom, Sophie took the stand first. Her voice trembled as she told a story about a forbidden love between her and David, claiming they had kept it secret to protect me. She spoke of late-night conversations and whispered promises. My parents testified next, backing her every word. My mother dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, while my father described David's supposed excitement about becoming a father to Sophie's child. The judge listened intently, and I could sense the sympathy in the room beginning to shift toward her. When it was our turn, Michael rose slowly and began by submitting the medical records into evidence. He explained that David's infertility had been diagnosed years before Sophie's child was born, making it impossible for him to be the father. The gallery buzzed with whispers. Sophie's lawyer objected, claiming the documents were forged, but Michael was ready. He called a representative from the hospital to verify their authenticity. Then he handed the judge David's notebook, pointing to passages where he had described Sophie's advances and his rejection of them. The atmosphere in the courtroom tightened. Finally, Michael requested a DNA test between Linda and Sophie's child to determine any biological relationship. Sophie's face drained of color. "That is unnecessary," she said quickly, her voice rising. The judge disagreed and ordered the test. Linda took the stand, her posture straight, her voice steady as she agreed to provide a sample. Sophie's hands gripped the edge of the table so hard, her knuckles whitened. Over the next week, the results were processed, and when we reconvened, the courtroom was silent as the judge read them aloud. Based on the DNA analysis, there is no biological relationship between the child and Linda Harris, the judge stated firmly. Therefore, the late David Harris is not the biological father. Sophie shook her head, muttering no over and over. My parents sat frozen as the weight of the truth crushed the story they had so readily embraced. The judge ruled entirely in my favor, dismissing Sophie's claim and ordering her to pay legal costs. I felt a rush of heat in my chest, not from anger this time, but from vindication. The battle was over and the truth had stood its ground. Outside the courthouse, the winter sun was pale, but it felt warm on my face as I stepped onto the stone steps. Sophie left through a side door, avoiding the cameras. Her head bowed while my parents lingered for a moment before walking toward me. My mother's eyes were red. My father's shoulders slumped. "Margaret, please forgive us," my mother said, her voice cracking. "We were wrong. We thought we were protecting the family." I looked at them and felt nothing but a hollow space where their place in my life used to be. "This is not something you can patch over with an apology," I said evenly. "You chose to believe the worst of me, and you stood beside her while she tried to destroy me. You did not protect the family. You destroyed it." I pulled my phone from my coat pocket, deleted both of their numbers in front of them, and walked away without looking back. Linda was waiting by her car, and when she saw me, her face softened. "Are you all right?" she asked quietly. I took a deep breath, and for the first time in months, I felt it was the truth when I answered, "Yes, I am." We drove back to my house in comfortable silence. That night I sat in David's study and looked around at the walls lined with books, the desk where he used to sketch building designs. I knew I could not live there anymore. The house was full of memories, both beautiful and painful, and it was time to create new ones somewhere else. I told Linda I wanted her to have the house. At first she refused, but I insisted. "You stood by me when no one else did." I said, "This is not just gratitude. It is my way of giving this place to someone who will honor it." Her eyes filled with tears, and she took my hand. "I never had a daughter," she whispered. "Now I do." In the months that followed, I sold my remaining assets and opened a small design studio, something David and I had once dreamed about. I poured my energy into my work, creating spaces that felt safe and alive. On weekends, Linda and I would visit art galleries or share long dinners talking about David and laughing in a way that no longer hurt. Letters arrived from Sophie and from my parents, but I never opened them. Sometimes I caught my reflection in a shop window and saw a woman I barely recognized. She was no longer the shadow standing in her sister's light, nor the wife defined by her husband's presence. She was her own person, forged by fire and betrayal, and still standing. The sweetest revenge was not in watching them fall. It was in building a life so solid they could never touch it again.